We often think a woman can only gain power in a man's world in two ways, through the bedroom or by becoming a steel lady in a man's suit, barking orders. But in the conservative Hollywood of the 50s, one actress showed there was a third way, a brilliant guerrilla manipulation. While studio bosses dismissed her as a cheap substitute for Betty Davis, she scribbled one word on the back of her director's chair: Mom. She'd approach the tough studio crew, gaffers and cameramen, bat her eyelashes, and ask them to help Mommy. The men thought they were rescuing a damsel in distress, but in reality, they built her empire without question. Today we'll dissect Ida Lupino's methods and discover how cunning, lack of funds, and the word mom allowed her to sidestep harsh censorship, conquer patriarchal Hollywood, and invent a style later mimicked by Tarantino and Scorsese. Hollywood crafted Ida Lupino to be a pretty prop. They paid her to bat her lashes, scream at the sight of gangsters, and don expensive gowns. In the 40s, this was the pinnacle of a woman's career in film. A woman could be a star, a muse, a face on a poster, but never the voice making decisions. A megaphone in a woman's hands was seen not as a tool, but as a joke. Cinema was a man's domain, not by law, but by silent agreement. But no one warned the producers that behind that porcelain face lurked the calculating mind of a strategist and the soul of a street fighter. She loathed being in front of the camera. She craved the power behind it. Ida Lupino's story isn't about feminism or a fight for equality. It's a survival guide written by a woman who learned to command wolves by pretending to be a sheep. You're here because you want to understand how, in one of America's most conservative eras, a woman seized the director's chair and held onto it. You're expecting a tale of a woman's hard lot and endless humiliations. Forget it. Reality is far more intriguing. Ida Lupino didn't ask for permission. She didn't play by the boys' club rules. She rewrote them to suit her, using cunning, psychological manipulation, and fearless tackling of taboo subjects. She made films on a shoestring, turning poverty into a style that Martin Scorsese and Quentin Tarantino would later emulate. Today, we'll break down her unique method. We'll uncover why the word mom became the most terrifying and effective tool on set, how to make a film about rape without showing a second of violence, and dodge the brutal Hays Code censorship, and why the Queen of Noir chose to film not glossy melodramas, but tales of maniacs and broken men. Get ready, we're stepping into Hollywood's dark territory. Act 1. Manipulating the male ego as a tool of absolute power. To grasp the genius of Ida Lupino, you first need to understand the atmosphere on a Hollywood set in the 50s. It wasn't just a job, it was a war zone with a testosterone-fueled hierarchy. Cameramen, lighting techs, carpenters, these were tough men, veterans of World War II or survivors of the Great Depression. They banded together in powerful unions and hated being bossed around, especially by a woman. In their world, a woman could be a star, a muse, a face on a poster, but a woman with a megaphone? That was a system malfunction, not a threat, an insult. Commanding men wasn't just odd, it was unnatural. Back then, a woman seeking power had two paths: become an iron lady, don a man's suit, and try to outshout the generator noise, like Dorothy Arzner, the lone female director of the 30s, or invent something entirely new. Arzner's way worked, but at the cost of constant warfare. Every day on set was a battle. Every decision had to be won through force, voice, pressure. It was a strategy of direct confrontation, and it demanded endless energy. Ida Lupino chose the second path. She knew that direct aggression in a man's world would only meet resistance. If you shout, they don't obey. They tolerate you or sabotage you. The male ego doesn't break under frontal assault. It shuts down. So Ida decided not to attack the male ego. She decided to crack it. Her main weapon was the back of the director's chair. It didn't have her name on it. No director or boss. Just one word: mother. This wasn't a cute gesture or a joke. It was a precise psychological calculation. Lupino consciously wore the mask they expected, but filled it with something entirely new. She came to the set not as a dictator, but as mommy, needing help from her strong, smart boys. In a patriarchal culture, a mother is untouchable. You can't compete with her. You can't humiliate her. You can't disobey her without breaking an inner taboo. Instead of barking, "Put the camera here and switch to a 50mm lens," she'd approach the cameraman, take his arm, and in a soft, almost intimate voice say, "Darling, I have a problem. I can't quite figure out how to capture this angle. I think if you do it like this, it will save the scene. What do you think? Will you help mommy with this?" Formally, he made the decision. In reality, he carried out her will. The result was astounding. Men who might have gone on strike over a lunch break melted. An ancient, ingrained instinct kicked in. Woman in distress, woman asking for protection. They felt like they were saving the film, that their experience and skill determined the scene's outcome, and they started working with doubled energy, lugging heavy equipment in the heat, staying late after shifts, pushing themselves to the limit, just to not disappoint mom. Ida Lupino knew the technical side inside out. During her sit-out years as an actress, when the studio punished her for refusing roles by withholding pay but forbidding outside work, she spent hours with cameramen and editors. She knew more about lenses, lighting, and storyboarding than many male directors of the time. But she was smart enough not to flaunt this competence directly. She let the men feel superior while they executed her vision to the letter. She hid control behind softness, power behind care, decisions behind questions. It was total manipulation. Lupino created a family microclimate on set where she was the undisputed matriarch. No one dared defy mom, not out of fear of being fired, but out of fear of disappointing her. She turned patriarchal prejudices, the idea that a woman is weak and needs protection, into a tool of absolute, almost tyrannical power. As she later wryly noted in an interview, "Men are wonderful creatures if you let them think they're in charge." But this theater wasn't about control for its own sake. Control over the crew was just a means. The main goal was something else. With a camera in hand and a loyal team, Ida Lupino aimed to point the lens where studio bosses forbade even looking. And for that, she had to do the impossible: sidestep the strictest censorship code in American film history. Act 2. Filming rape under the Hays Code. To grasp the magnitude of what Ida Lupino pulled off in 1950, you need to understand the Hays Code. It wasn't just a list of suggestions. It was a draconian rulebook that strangled any hint of realism in Hollywood. Forbidden were not just naked bodies or overt violence. Censors dictated the length of kisses, banned showing married couples in the same bed, and erased entire swaths of human experience. The Hays Code wasn't just a moral filter, it was a tool for controlling imagination, a system that decided what the audience could see, feel, and even desire, and what they should be punished for. It didn't just ban scenes, it obliterated the language to talk about pain. If something had no words, it was as if it didn't exist. If you want me to break down how this system worked and whom it crushed, drop one word in the comments: code. The most terrifying taboo in this system was rape. The word itself was blacklisted. It couldn't be spoken, couldn't be written in credits, and certainly couldn't be depicted. Studios steered clear of the topic, fearing boycotts from religious leagues, newspaper campaigns, and financial sanctions. If sexual violence was implied in a plot, it always stayed off-screen, turning into a vague hint. Women in such stories were not people, but functions: a reason for revenge, a trigger for male rage, a plot device. But Ida Lupino decided to make a film about it, not hint at it, not skirt around it, but make trauma the central theme of the picture. The film was called Outrage. Even that word was a forced euphemism. Naming the film directly was impossible. The myth says censorship kills art. Ida Lupino's reality proved the opposite. Censorship forces art to evolve. Unable to show the act of physical violence, she had to invent a visual language that conveyed the horror without breaking a single rule of the code. And what she created was far scarier than any graphic scene. Lupino made a radical shift in focus. She was interested not in the crime, but its echo. Not the moment of impact, but life after it. The chase scene in Outrage is a masterclass in building suspense. Ida doesn't use cheap jump scares. She works with space and sound. The main character, Anne, is walking home after work. She moves through an industrial zone. Not a soul around. We hear only the click of her heels on the pavement. Click, click, click. Then the rhythm changes. A second set of footsteps appears. Instead of showing the pursuer's face in close-up, Lupino focuses on shadows. Long, distorted shadows on warehouse walls become the visual embodiment of impending doom. The heroine runs through a maze of crates and fences, and the camera darts with her, creating a sense of disorientation. We're not watching the victim from the outside. We're inside her body. The scene's climax is a genius workaround of censorship. When the pursuer catches up to Anne, Lupino doesn't show the bodies colliding. She shows the details of the surroundings. We see a toppled water can rolling on the ground. We see a pigeon taking off from a ledge in panic. And just as a scream should pierce the air, Lupino drowns it out with the sharp, deafening blast of a passing truck's horn. That sound isn't just a device, it's a verdict. The horn drowns out the scream, just as society drowns out others' pain. The world keeps moving, unpaused, while a person is broken in an alley. The viewer doesn't see the violence, but their mind, fueled by these metaphors, paints the picture on its own. And human imagination, as Ida knew, is always scarier than reality. By shifting the focus from the physical act, which in male cinema often turns into exploitation or even covert eroticization of violence, Lupino achieved a unique psychological effect. Outrage became a film not about defiled honor, but about trauma, about what happens after. The film shows how Anne, after the assault, flinches at her fiancé's touch, how ordinary city sounds trigger panic attacks, how the world, familiar yesterday, turns into a field of threats today. Lupino essentially made a film about post-traumatic stress disorder, decades before the term entered common language. While male directors used violence as a plot mechanism to kickstart a revenge story, Ida Lupino explored the shattered psyche of the victim. She showed that the crime doesn't end when the criminal exits the frame. Outrage became proof of her main directorial principle. What you hide in the shadows frightens more than what you expose to the light. She turned limitations into a magnifying glass for emotions. But if, in Outrage, Ida Lupino explored female fear, in her next work she decided to venture into territory considered the exclusive domain of men. She decided to make a noir, no compromises, no softening. Act 3, The Hitchhiker, the first true noir by a woman. In the 50s, an unspoken division of labor existed. Men made westerns and noirs, while women, if allowed to direct at all, found themselves relegated to melodramas about broken hearts and family sagas. It was believed a woman's psyche was too delicate for brutality, that her gaze couldn't capture the harsh truths of a man's world. Noir stood as the pinnacle of masculinity. Dusty streets, guns, silent men who took punches without complaint. Ida Lupino took this stereotype, loaded it into a .38 caliber revolver, and fired point blank, releasing the film The Hitchhiker. It became the first classic film noir in history directed by a woman. And in it, she made the boldest move imaginable. She completely removed women from the frame. No femme fatales, no devoted wives, no love intrigues. The entire cast consisted of three men trapped in the tin box of a car in the sun-scorched desert. This move wasn't just a formality, it dismantled the genre. Traditional noir revolved around women as a source of danger. Femme fatales, seductresses, destroyers of men's destinies. Ida Lupino tossed this crutch aside. She wasn't interested in female treachery. She sought male vulnerability. The plot is simple and terrifying. Two friends go fishing, pick up a hitchhiker, and he turns out to be an escaped serial killer. One simple mistake, and their familiar world crumbles. Ida Lupino doesn't romanticize the criminal, nor does she make heroes of the victims. Her villain, Emmett Myers, draws inspiration from the real-life maniac, Billy Cook, who terrorized America just a few years before the film was made. Lupino gave him a chilling physical detail. One of his eyes was paralyzed and never closed. Even in sleep, that dead gaze remained open. This wasn't effect for effect's sake. It embodied visual violence. The captives can't relax for a second. Even sleep offers no escape. But the most important part of the film unfolds not with the killer, but with his victims. Ida Lupino methodically dismantles the myth of the tough American guy. Under the gun, her characters, ordinary working men, perform no heroics, crack no witty lines, and devise no brilliant escape plans. They sweat, they panic, they argue. They're ready to betray each other for a chance to survive. In men's films of the time, fear usually masked itself with bravado. With Lupino, fear takes center stage. She observes men with cold, almost clinical curiosity, like an entomologist studying insects under glass. She strips them of the protective armor of masculinity and leaves them alone with their bodies, trembling, sweaty, cornered. Technically, the film stands as a masterpiece of minimalism. The budget was laughable, and Lupino once again turns shortcomings into strengths. Most of the film unfolds inside a car. The camera often sits in the back seat, literally squeezing the viewer into the space between the characters. We're not observers, we're the fourth, helpless passenger. The desert outside the window doesn't resemble a space of freedom. In Lupino's hands, it transforms into another trap. The endless horizon offers no hope. It underscores that there's nowhere to run. Lupino uses the sun as a tool of pressure. The light doesn't save, it exhausts. It erases shadows, stripping the characters of any chance to hide. In this noir, there's no usual nighttime romance. Everything happens in daylight, in plain view, and that makes it even scarier. The Hitchhiker proved that Ida Lupino mastered suspense as well as Hitchcock. But while Hitchcock played with the audience, turning fear into an intellectual game, Lupino approached it differently. She struck with facts. Her film is dry, harsh, and offers no comfort. It doesn't provide catharsis. It leaves the viewer in the same state as the characters, drained and empty. With this film, Ida Lupino revealed Hollywood's simple and unpleasant truth. To create the most masculine movie of the year, one doesn't need to be a man. One needs the courage to confront fear without embellishment. But this triumph represented only one side of her story. To understand where she found such cold-bloodedness and the desire to break genre rules, we must go back to the place she escaped from, to that golden cage Hollywood built for her. Act 4, The Prison of Beauty. Why the poor man's Bette Davis turned her back on $1 million face. To grasp why Ida Lupino desperately clawed her way into the dusty, smoke-filled director's chair, you must look at what she left behind. She walked away from the top of the world. In the 40s, Ida Lupino was a sought-after Hollywood actress. She held an exclusive contract with Warner Brothers, a fat paycheck and a steady stream of roles. She starred alongside the biggest names of the era and graced the silver screen regularly. From the outside, it looked like a fairy tale. On the inside, it felt like a maximum security cell. To the studio, she wasn't a person, she was an asset. A face to be used as long as it sold. Behind the scenes at Warner Brothers, she bore a humiliating nickname, the poor man's Betty Davis. The bosses didn't see her as a standalone star, but as a backup. If a role called for hysteria, madness, or heavy drama, and Betty Davis was busy or refused, the script landed on Lupino's desk. She received the roles of gangster molls, psychopaths, women on the edge, characters who screamed, suffered, and died beautifully by the third act. This wasn't a choice, it was a conveyor belt. The myth says Golden Age actresses were temperamental divas. Ida's reality was different. She was too smart for the roles they offered. She read scripts and saw flat dialogue, cardboard characters, and pre-packaged emotions. More and more, she told the studio, no. Back then, turning down a role was an act of war. The studio system owned actors almost entirely. Defiance meant punishment, suspension. They'd strip you of your paycheck and ban you from working elsewhere. It was a financial noose. The studio planned to wear her down, make her bored, broke, and eventually crawl back for any role. Jack Warner was sure he knew how to break a difficult actress, but he miscalculated. While other suspended actors drowned their sorrows in bars, complained, or played golf, Ida Lupino returned to the studio. But not to the dressing room. She haunted the set like a ghost. She sat in the shadows, away from the spotlight, and watched. She wasn't watching the actors. She watched those with real power. She spent hours observing how cinematographers set up lights, not for beauty, but to control the face. She asked editors why a scene cut here and not a second later. She studied the language of lenses, camera angles, the rhythm of movement within a frame. She started to understand the core truth. An actor is material. The director decides what that material becomes. An actor can deliver the performance of a lifetime, and it can end up on the cutting room floor. An actor can be mediocre, and editing can make them great. Power belongs to the one who says, action. In those months of forced idleness, the actress Ida Lupino died, and the director was born. She realized she hated her beautiful face not out of vanity, but because it was a commodity others controlled. Her body belonged to the contract, her image to the studio, her time to someone else's schedule. She wanted control back. Her decision wasn't impulsive, it was cold calculation. When her contract with Warner Brothers ended, she didn't renew it. At 30, this was considered career suicide. Agents thought she was crazy. Walking away from guaranteed fame and fortune meant voluntarily stepping out of the game. But Ida Lupino already knew the game she planned to play next. She traded her face for the camera, comfort for risk, a glossy prison for the unknown. And the next step was the most dangerous. She decided not to find a new master. She decided to become one herself. Act 5. Guerrilla Hollywood, the filmmakers and the art of shooting without a dime. When Ida Lupino slammed the door on Warner Brothers, she didn't just leave the studio system. She stepped out from under its protection. Together with her husband, screenwriter Collier Young, she founded an independent production company with a defiantly simple name, The Filmmakers. This wasn't a bid to compete with the big studios. It was a bid to survive outside their radar. The myth of independent cinema claims it's a realm of freedom. But the reality of the late 40s was different. Independence meant poverty. The big studios had sound stages the size of airplane hangars, in-house orchestras, theater contracts, and armies of lawyers. Ida Lupino had her savings, a few connections, and the knowledge that she couldn't afford a single mistake. Every film was a gamble with everything on the line. Lack of money wasn't a problem, it was a philosophy. Lupino quickly learned that without resources, precision was mandatory. No luxury, no extra takes, no just-in-case scenes. She ditched the sound stages and took the camera where studio films rarely ventured, onto the streets. She shot in real apartments, actual hospital rooms, cheap motels, and the vacant lots of Los Angeles. The camera captured not gloss, but the cracks in reality. Real signs, random passers-by, uneven light made it into the frame. This wasn't a stylistic statement, it was a necessity. But it gave her films a documentary feel that couldn't be faked on a soundstage. Shooting often felt like a covert operation. No permits, no time. The crew would quickly unload from a van, shoot a scene in 1 or 2 takes, and vanish before the cops or location owners showed up. The rule was simple: shoot and scram. Every item in the frame had a practical purpose. Props came from home. Actors wore their own clothes or borrowed from Lupino's wardrobe. Cars were personal or loaned. When there was no money for a camera dolly, Lupino used a wheelchair. The cameraman sat in it with the camera, while an assistant smoothly pushed along a corridor or sidewalk. This solution was born out of poverty, but on screen it looked like a stroke of genius. The wheelchair was more maneuverable than bulky tracks. It allowed movement in tight spaces, heightening the sense of confinement and pressure. What should have screamed cheap became part of the style. The budgets for the filmmakers' movies were laughable by Hollywood standards, but this forced Lupino to plan every shot in advance. Film and time forgave no mistakes. She couldn't afford to reshoot scenes, so actors had to nail it on the first try. The camera didn't embellish, it documented. This enforced austerity led to an unexpected artistic result. Lupino's films looked raw, unsettling, and hauntingly real. Without realizing it, she invented an aesthetic that would be called revolutionary a decade later. French New Wave directors would write manifestos about shooting on the street, using natural light, and the observer camera. Ida Lupino did it first, not from theory, but from necessity. She proved that budget isn't the main thing. Control over the story is. The filmmakers became a guerrilla unit within Hollywood. They didn't change the system, they sidestepped it. But even this freedom came at a cost. Every new film brought them closer to either a breakthrough or total collapse. And the most daring project of this independence was a film where personal life and cinema intertwined in the most dangerous way. A film where Ida Lupino looked at a man not as a hero, not as a villain, but as the weakest link in the system. Act 6, Sympathy for the Devil, deconstructing the American man in The Bigamist. If someone decided to film what transpired on the set of The Bigamist, it would be the most absurd soap opera in Hollywood history. The script about a man living a double life came from Ida Lupino's ex-husband, Collier Young. Her current husband, Howard Duff, played the lead role of the bigamist. Joan Fontaine, the current wife of her ex-husband, portrayed the legal wife. And Ida Lupino herself, directing the film, took on the role of the other woman. Any other set would have devolved into a battlefield. Here, it was cold professionalism. Ida Lupino transformed this emotional knot not into a scandal, but into a tool. She wielded personal chaos as a magnifying glass for the film's theme. The central question of The Bigamist was provocative even by today's standards. What if the criminal isn't a monster? Harry Graham isn't a predator or a cynical manipulator. He's a tired, lonely salesman caught between expectations and duties. He commits a crime not out of malice, but out of weakness. Ida Lupino does what male directors avoided. She refuses to moralize. In films of that era, bigamists appeared as cartoonish villains to be exposed and punished. Lupino turns the camera the other way. She's interested not in the sin, but in the mechanism. Why does a man break? Harry must be strong. He must be the provider. He's not allowed doubt or fatigue. This pressure births catastrophe. Lupino also shatters female archetypes. Instead of the usual wife as victim, mistress as temptress setup, she flips the script. The legal wife is a cold, rational career woman, unable to provide emotional support. The mistress is a tired, unassuming waitress offering simple human warmth. This isn't an excuse, it's an incision. Ida Lupino films herself with not a hint of glamorization. Her character looks faded, anxious, already defeated. She knows she's doing wrong, but can't stop. In The Bigamist, there's almost no passion. There's fatigue, there's loneliness, there's fear of exposure. The key scenes aren't scandals but pauses, silence on a bus, a conversation over a cheap table, moments when people don't know what to say. Lupino uses the camera as before, tight, suffocating. The hero is constantly trapped in spaces, cars, corridors, phone booths. Even the street doesn't offer freedom. The film's ending brings no relief. The court doesn't feel like a triumph of justice. It feels like a formality. When Harry is pressed to explain his actions, it becomes clear. He can't articulate the reason. And in this lies Ida Lupino's main diagnosis. Evil in her films is born not from cruelty, but from the inability to speak about one's feelings. Not from a desire to destroy, but from the fear of being unwanted. The Bigamist became Lupino's most radical film, not because the topic was taboo, but because she refused to give the audience a comfortable position. She doesn't justify, she doesn't blame, she shows. But this psychological triumph was only possible because Lupino had already learned to seize power by breaking the rules. And for the first time, it happened not out of ambition, but out of catastrophe. To understand how Ida Lupino ended up in the director's chair, you have to go back to the moment when she had no choice. Act 7, a chance that became fate. Great careers rarely kick off with a clear plan. More often, they start with disaster. Ida Lupino had no intention of becoming a director in '49. She penned the script for the film Not Wanted and took on the role of producer, entrusting the direction to silent film veteran Elmer Clifton. It was a gesture of respect. Hollywood had its hierarchy, and Ida knew how to play by the rules. The project was risky from the get-go. The film tackled the story of an unwed mother, a figure American society in the '40s preferred to ignore. These women weren't publicly condemned. They were simply erased. Filming kicked off without a hitch, but 3 days in, everything collapsed. The director suffered a massive heart attack right on set. For a big studio project, this would mean a pause. For an independent film, it spelled death. The budget was bare bones. Investor money evaporated with each day of delay. Finding a new director for that kind of money and on such short notice proved impossible. The project faced a choice: shut down or risk it all. Ida Lupino took off her shoes and stepped behind the camera. This wasn't a heroic gesture, it was pragmatism. She knew the script by heart. She understood the film she wanted to make. And most importantly, she realized that if filming stopped, the filmmakers wouldn't survive their first project. She worked fast and precise. No grand declarations, no fight for credits. Her style was a sharp departure from Clifton's. Where the old school favored static, theatrical shots, Lupino injected nerve and subjectivity. The camera began to breathe with the heroine. She ditched the distance. The audience found themselves inside the story. This was especially palpable in the birth scenes. Lupino shot them not as a miracle, but as a trial. No sentimentality, no softening. She used real hospital settings, odd camera angles, blurred focus, and distorted sound. Everything contributed to the feeling of loneliness and physical dread. It was a perspective that couldn't be faked. It was cinema made by someone who knew the fear of physical vulnerability. The film finished on time and within budget. It turned out to be commercially successful. And here, Ida Lupino made a move that best describes her character. She refused the director's credit. In the credits of Not Wanted, Elmer Clifton was listed as the director. Anyone else in her position would have demanded recognition. It would have been the perfect moment for a loud debut. But Ida knew Clifton was dying. If she took the credit, he'd lose his health insurance and final payments. She chose to stay in the shadows. This wasn't altruism. It was understanding the system. She knew. The industry already knew the truth. And that was enough. Rumors about who really called the shots on set spread instantly. In Hollywood, information circulates faster than official credits. Ida Lupino began to be seen differently, not as an actress with ambitions, but as someone who could keep a project afloat. It was this unofficial debut that paved her way to future films. But before the system realized it had made a mistake, Ida Lupino had already solidified her role as a director. She entered the profession not because she was allowed, but because in a critical moment, there was no one else to take responsibility. And from that moment, there was no turning back. Act 8, Frame Psychology, Claustrophobia as a Special Effect. Ida Lupino didn't just tell stories about people in trouble. She made the audience feel that trouble in their bones. While big studio directors chased grandeur and spectacle, Lupino went the other way. She wasn't interested in sweeping vistas or grand sets. She was interested in pressure. The pressure of space, the pressure of the frame, the pressure of having no way out. Her visual style could be summed up in one word: trap. Part of this was necessity. Lupino shot in real, cheap interiors, apartments, motels, cars. She couldn't move walls like they did on MGM soundstages. But where another director saw limits, Lupino saw metaphor. Her characters were always captives. Captives of social roles, captives of trauma, captives of circumstances. And the camera highlighted this captivity. Lupino loves shooting through barriers. In her films, you often watch characters through bed frames, stair railings, door jambs, foggy glass. The foreground is deliberately cluttered. There's always something between the viewer and the character. It's like we're peeping, and that creates a sense of shame and anxiety. The character doesn't just suffer, they suffer in a cage. In The Hitchhiker, this technique is pushed to the limit. The camera almost never leaves the car's interior. It's pressed against the ceiling, the doors, the bodies. The space suffocates. Even the sky, when it appears, doesn't feel like freedom. It looms like a heavy lid over the car. Lupino films fear not with faces, but with bodies. She often lowered the camera below the usual level, to knees, ankles, hands. She believed faces could lie, but bodies couldn't. Clenched fists, nervous foot tapping, hunched shoulders interested her more than a perfectly lit profile. In The Bigamist, dialogues often play in the background. Meanwhile, the camera studies the hero's hands, limp on his knees or his back, bent under the weight of lies. It creates a sense of physical exhaustion, almost bodily pain. Light and shadow in her films aren't decoration. They're instruments of pressure. Lupino's shadows aren't romantic. They don't add mystery. They press down like prison bars. In Outrage, industrial structures cast shadows that fall on the heroine like cell bars, even before her life truly becomes a prison. Lupino wasn't afraid of darkness. She used it as a space for the viewer's imagination. The less shown, the more imagined. The less air in the frame, the stronger the threat feels. This style, tense, tight, claustrophobic, became her signature. It was born not from aesthetic manifestos, but from forced economy. And that's why it was so precise. Lupino proved that anxiety doesn't come from a monster in the closet. It comes from the feeling that the walls are closing in. But the era was changing, and the Hollywood she learned to navigate was disappearing. By the late 50s, the studio system was collapsing. A new industry was rising, leaving little room for figures like Ida Lupino. Hollywood tried to push her out again, and once more, Ida chose not retreat, but a detour. Act 9, Twilight Zone, where the exile found a new home. By the end of the 50s, Hollywood had forever changed. The studio system Ida Lupino had learned to survive crumbled. But in its ruins, not a garden of freedom, but a colder machine emerged. Big movies grew pricier. Risks soared. Producers became more cautious. In this new logic, no room existed for a female director crafting cheap, grim films about trauma, fear, and weakness. Ida Lupino no longer fit the equation. Hollywood didn't declare war on her. It simply shut the doors. For any other star, this would mean the end. Memoirs, rare interviews, a slow fade into obscurity. But Ida Lupino was a pragmatist. If theaters no longer needed her, she ventured where studio snobs looked down upon: television. By the late 50s, TV was seen as an elephant graveyard, a place for those who couldn't hack it on the big screen, a fast conveyor belt, low status, no authorship. For Lupino, it became salvation. Television needed not geniuses, but professionals, people who could shoot fast, cheap, and without drama. Those who could craft a story with 3 walls and 2 actors. Ida Lupino was the perfect candidate. She became possibly the most productive female director on American TV in the 60s. Alfred Hitchcock presents The Fugitive, Have Gun, Will Travel. Her name regularly flashed in the credits, even if just for a second. Producers loved her not for a female perspective, but for her discipline. She never blew a budget, never missed a deadline, and could build tension from thin air. But the pinnacle of her TV era was her work on The Twilight Zone. Show creator Rod Serling sought directors who could convey anxiety, paranoia, and unreality. Ida Lupino was the only woman he trusted with an episode of the original series. The episode was called The Masks. The plot was brutal and simple. A dying rich man gathered his greedy heirs and forced them to wear grotesque masks reflecting their vices. He promised an inheritance on one condition: the masks must stay on until midnight. It was right up her alley. A confined space, family hierarchy, people forced to wear imposed roles. Lupino squeezed every drop from the 25-minute format. She turned the mansion into a cage, the masks into extensions of faces. The camera circled slowly, building paranoia. Light sliced the space, highlighting distortions. The episode's climax, when the characters removed the mask to find their faces had taken on the masked shapes, was true body horror. Not flashy, not loud, but sticky and unsettling. It was perfect television, taut to the limit, no sentimentality. The irony was that in The Twilight Zone, Ida Lupino also appeared on the other side of the camera, as an actress. In the episode The 16mm Shrine, she played an aging movie star trapped in a room with projections of her old films. A woman who chose to vanish inside an image rather than live in reality. It was a chilling meta-statement. Lupino played the fate she herself avoided. While her character dissolved in past illusions, the real Ida stood behind the camera, building the future of television. She chose work over nostalgia. Her TV period lasted almost 20 years, over 100 episodes, dozens of genres. But this success had a downside. Television is an art without memory. Directors' names fade faster than frames. Ida Lupino began to disappear again. Not because she stopped working, but because the format left no trace. When the cameras shut off, silence remained. And it seemed Ida Lupino's story would end just like that, without a final chord, without recognition, without a return. But stories rarely end where you expect. Act 10, The Invisible Architect. Why Scorsese and Tarantino bow to her ghost. When Ida Lupino passed away in '95, it barely made a ripple. Obituaries pegged her as a '40s actress, a woman with a steely gaze in supporting roles. Her directing career? Mentioned in passing. Like a footnote in history. Her films didn't make prime time. They weren't dissected in film schools. They didn't make the greatest lists. It seemed history had overlooked her. But it was just a pause. Cinema has a strange knack for reviving those forgotten too soon. The first to speak of Ida Lupino as an auteur was a man who understood the value of fringe cinema, Martin Scorsese. He didn't label Lupino as the first woman, he called her an artist. An auteur with a signature style you couldn't confuse. He wrote that her films had a rawness stripped of frills, that they possessed a rare quality, the ability to show the fragility of brutal people. That was the key. Scorsese saw in Lupino what others chose to ignore. She didn't film genres, she filmed states of being. Her influence reached further than most realize. Her minimalism, on-location shoots, rejection of gloss, and fascination with broken psyches all became the bedrock of independent American cinema. She started before it was trendy, before it became a manifesto. John Cassavetes, often hailed as the father of American indie cinema, began in the late '50s. Ida Lupino was doing it a decade earlier, without the term, without the theory, without the backing. The French New Wave would talk about the camera stylo, about cinema as personal expression. Lupino was already using the camera as a tool of pressure and confession, because she couldn't afford studio sets. Even Quentin Tarantino, a fan of gritty genre films, indirectly inherited her approach. Terse dialogue, no moralizing, a focus on marginal characters. For him, like Lupino, genre was just a shell. Today, film scholars admit, Ida Lupino was the mother of independent American cinema. But that recognition came too late. She didn't fit any tidy narrative. She was too tough for women's cinema, and too genre for the auteur pantheon. She didn't fight the system with banners or slogans. She just worked. And maybe that's why she was forgotten. History loves grand gestures and simple myths. Ida Lupino offered neither. She didn't call herself a feminist. She didn't demand recognition. She didn't explain how she was making history. She made films. Her legacy isn't in slogans. It's in the method. She used limitations as a resource. She turned censorship into a language. She made control a form of survival. Ida Lupino didn't smash the glass ceiling with her head. She dismantled it into lenses for her cameras. And through those lenses, we still see the world as she did, brutal, cramped, but full of desperate, pulsing life. That's why her films haven't aged. They're not about an era, they're about pressure. And pressure, as we know, never disappears. Her legacy today is more alive than the glossy '50s blockbusters that snagged a pile of Oscars. Why? Because blockbusters aged. They were too tied to the morals of their time. Lupino's films, about fear, loneliness, violence, and moral ambiguity, haven't aged a day. She proved a woman director doesn't have to make women's films, in the dismissive sense, about flowers and weddings. She can make films that are tough, unsettling, and frightening. She can delve into the male psyche deeper than men themselves. Ida Lupino's story isn't just the biography of a successful woman. It's a textbook on guerrilla warfare with reality. She entered a world where men wrote the rules, controlled the money, and women were allowed only to stand prettily in the spotlight. She didn't waste her life complaining about injustice. Instead, she hacked the system's code. She used the weak woman stereotype and the mom label on her director's chair to command an army of technicians. She used the lack of money as a stylistic device, creating the noir realism genre. She used censorship restrictions as fuel for visual inventiveness, making her films scarier and deeper than the Hays Code allowed. Limitations are a resource. A lack of budget or strict censorship forces the brain to find genius solutions that live on for decades. Soft power is more effective than aggression. Ida managed men by playing the mommy role and achieved more than those who tried to fight them. Truth is always in demand. Glossy sets decay, but a sincere story about human pain remains relevant forever. If you're intrigued by how Lupino dodged censorship, you should learn about pre-code Hollywood, the wild period of the early 30s when anything went in films, from drugs to open decadence, and why it was shut down overnight. But that's another story. Subscribe to the channel and you won't miss that video.